Hello and welcome to SAE Tomorrow Today. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Amy Chu, Director, Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium, SAE ITC. Welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Thank you, Grayson. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. It's great to shine a light on what you're doing with the AVSC because it's really interesting and not enough people know about it. So happy to share that story. Before we get into the AVSC, I'd love to chat with you about growing up. Amy, as a child growing up, you were fascinated by technology. Was there a moment or a product that started this fascination?
There's many. So I'm not sure where it started exactly, but I think it was a combination of my dad's fascination with sci-fi. As a kid, and I'm seeing this with my own kids, as a kid, you watch what your parents put on the TV. And there was always way too much Star Trek. And I apologize to those who are Star Trek fans, but I didn't really like that show. But I do remember watching, and their use of the technology and computers were kind of like not really a thing back then. And so it was sort of this fantasy. And I remember that, that really was something that I picked up on, like, wow, that's so cool, all the things that they could do. And then my next door neighbor got a Macintosh, and that's where I became really obsessed. I was begging my parents to get a Macintosh of our own. They didn't, and I couldn't understand why at the time. Now it all makes sense. But so because I didn't have access to my own computer or even the influence of electronics, hands-on things, I used my imagination. And so, playing with my cousins or my friends down the street, I always wanted to incorporate computers. And so instead of having a real computer, I built one out of cardboard and paper and lots of glue. And I pretended like I was doing the Star Trek thing. And so I think that was probably the start of it. And then it just sort of threaded through life from there.
Were you teleporting friends or dolls or
of course,
to other places?
Course. Yes, all the time. Yep. The dolls were teleporting. I was always teleporting, and I was always in charge too. That's the key.
No, it's incredible because the imagination is the greatest gift that we all have, because when you sit there and you play with boxes or you play with toys and you let your imagination run, you can develop new things, you can create new things. We all see examples from history from Sir Isaac Newton. Did this whole playing with your imagination, building computers out of a cardboard box, did that lead you down this career path? Say, you know what, I'm actually going to work on a real computer one day. I'm going to take my incredible imagination and build something really cool on a computer?
I wish I could say that was it. But no, it sort of went away because another important point is that I didn't have anybody in my life who was technically capable or, even worked in a technical area. My dad was in finance. My mom was a legal secretary. All my relatives were doing business type roles. So when I was growing up, I thought, well, what do I want to be when I grow up? I really looked to the people around me, and engineer wasn't even in my vocabulary at the time. But it wasn't until high school where I started to go into science and math, and I took some computer classes just so I could get my hands on a computer because I didn't have one at home. And I loved it, but I never thought of it as a job until I was in AP calculus class, which was, special when I was a senior in high school, and my calculus teacher was like, hey, you're really good at math and science. You should really consider engineering. And I thought, what's that? I seriously had no idea. And so I started this, thought, well, okay, they say I could maybe do that. I'll try it out. And that's where, it wasn't until college where I really started to explore a technical field for myself.
That high school teacher, then you could say, changed the course of your life.
Yes. I would say so. Not one of my favorite classes either at that time. But I will say that in college, calculus ended up being one of my favorites. I really liked calculus and nobody else did. And I thought that was weird.
And you got to be pretty smart to be an AP calculus. That's like for smart people, which is incredible. It's when you look at this, and it's probably in the 90s when Disney always did the teacher appreciation. They would do that whole big thing, and then they fly the teachers to Disney World and they'd recognize them. It's incredible that the impact that teachers have on students' lives throughout there's
totally.
These key moments. It's absolutely incredible. And I'm so happy to hear that you had a wonderful experience in school. So you have this great experience in school. You do fancy calculus stuff and you decide, I'm going to be an engineer. And then you've got this incredible 16-year run in Harman where you're working on the future experience team that you managed. Was that like, okay, future experience, we're going to do some Star Trek stuff?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note that before I got to the future experience team, I spent about 16 years? Oh, 12 years. Okay, the first 12 years was program management. And that was, I came across that because when I have to back up a little bit here because the story sort of all makes sense if you talk about it together. You know, I went to college, I got my EE degree, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go bang out some technology. This is awesome. And then when I got there, I was kind of like, oh, this is what it is? Oh, okay. And I just remember feeling like I wasn't as excited as my fellow engineers in the group about, you know, the boards coming in and, you know, us working on them and testing them. I was like, that's cool. But I was more interested in how we got the boards, how we designed them, the tools we used, all the different people we had to interface with. And that was sort of my passion. So that's how I ended up in program management in the first place is I basically said, you know, I don't really want to be the designer, the one banging out the technology. I want to bang out the product, but, you know, by working with the organization. And so by doing program management for as many years as I did, it really gave me the full spectrum of how, you know, not just the imagination of how technology is created and the innovations, you know, come about, but then how do you actually get it on paper, get it into a prototype, test it out, you know, get it to production level, and then actually mass produce these things at a certain rate. Like it just, the whole process fascinated me. So I got to do that for 12 years. And then when I finally made it to the Star Trek part, like the future experience team, I was like, oh my gosh, this is super cool. I get to think up stuff now and I get to help them realize these things, but I still had all that experience and how hard it is to realize those things. And it was like, oh, wow, you guys need to think about this, 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 and this. They're like, you're crazy. You know, we're out in Silicon Valley and they're like, we can do anything. And I'm like, well, you could, but, you know, once you get to the point where you have to bridge it from, you know, these cool ideas to something that actually consumers use, there's a process there. And that was the vision of my CTO at Harman at the time. And when he hired me, he said, we need somebody who can, you know, speak both sides. They can talk to, you know, the futuristic, you know, minds and keep them excited about these innovations. But then they also need to, you know, bridge that gap between these really cool ideas to products we can actually sell. And I thought that was brilliant. I love that CTO and, you know, the vision that he had for the organization was very holistic instead of, you know, just like trying to make a profit or trying to think of really cool stuff for CES this year. You know, I got to do both. And so, you know, I tell that long story because I think it sort of shows the broadness of the experience that I've had and how now I get to put it all together. And that's pretty cool stuff.
It's incredibly cool. And you know, hearing that story, the one thing that comes to mind that's one of the biggest issues that we don't have enough skills for today is supply chain management. Mm-hmm. And so did you learn supply chain management and how to deal with shortages of chips or this product's not available or this
all the
product's
time delayed? Yes. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that makes the job of a program manager at a tier one supplier, you know, really challenging. It's not just deciding. There's a whole process of like deciding how you're going to choose these suppliers in the first place. And then you get the deal all set, everybody's ready to go. And then there's that long-term production thing. You got to keep the lines running. And as a tier one supplier, your worst nightmare is to have a part shortage. You know, your plant can't deliver what they promised. And then all of a sudden your automotive OEM is lying down, and that's millions of dollars per minute. It's a serious situation. Nobody ever wants to be in that. So once you've lived through a couple of those horrible times, you really learn quickly how important supply chain management is. Yes.
You're on the Star Trek team now, and then you start working on the emerging technology of driver monitoring, which today is in the news for a lot of the right reasons and a lot of the wrong reasons. What did you learn during that experience when driver monitoring and you were kind of building that? And this was, you know, before all the news headlines.
Well, first of all, that project at the time, I think it was 2015-ish, somewhere around there. At that time, it was really like some Star Trek-y stuff. It was like, I remember talking to again, this was one of those situations where I was talking to the future experience team and my boss, who was the VP of technology strategy for Harman, and they were like, this is the coolest thing. We're going to be able to tell how hard your brain is working when you're having a conversation, driving down the road. I was like, wow, that's super cool. And we learned about, it's the pupil dilation. And, you know, they would say, the way I used to have to describe it at the CES presentation was, you know, normally you're familiar with your pupils dilating with light, but there's actually different muscles that indicate how hard your brain is working, and thus the cognitive workload of your brain. So, you know, my mind is just blown. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. But then when I would turn around and try to describe it to the business people, you know, they're thinking in terms of, how am I going to sell this? Are my automotive consumers going to want this? You know, and so they'd be like, I don't get it. Why do I care? And I was like, yeah, but you're driving down the road, and have you ever been on a conference call and you forget how you got there? Like, you've driven your whole self there, but you don't remember it. And so those are the kinds of things. And still the people, even within my own company, who I was trying to, you know, bridge that gap and get them to a place of, you know, how they could utilize this. And we prioritized driver handoff, because at that time, you know, we were talking about automated driving, driver assistance. One of the things that we were really concentrated on was the driver monitoring during a handoff. And so all this talk about, you know, the vehicle's going to take over, but then it might have to give control back to the human driver in order to know that when the vehicle gives that control back, that it's going to be safe. You need to know if the driver is engaged or if they have, you know, too much on their mind. And so that was one of the main points. But it was hard to get that across, because there were still a lot of naysayers that were like, oh, no, we don't want that. Nobody wants that. What are you going to do? Turn off the radio? Are you going to reroute the drive? Are you going to, you know, hold my calls? God forbid you know, the vehicle takes control of something that I don't want them to, right? And so those are real concerns. What about privacy? So there was just a lot of more questions than answers at that time. And so it was exciting. I thought it was the coolest thing, but yeah, I ran into a place where it was like nobody was really quite biting on that at that time.
I love the analogy of being on the conference call, because we've all been there. You're focused on this, and you're like, whoa, okay, I'm at my destination. That flew by. And you really had no idea, because you weren't fully engaged in driving, and driver monitoring could help make that potentially a safer ride for you. But today, driver monitoring, as I said earlier, is in the news. We have the privacy debate around driver monitoring, where some companies decide to take the data and house it internally. What are your current thoughts on the current state? What are your thoughts on the current state of driver monitoring? Will this become a regulatory issue? Will it become a privacy issue? Is this just going to become an absolute nightmare? Where do you think this is going to go?
I think that my stance on driver monitoring is that it is one of many potential tools that can help with this transition period that we're in. I do think that there's still some unanswered questions about privacy, and I think that's a really big one. But at the same time, I also think that there's got to be this help with the transition. We're not going to go, and I think this was the thought that a lot of the people back in 2015 that I was talking to, they just assumed we were going to get to level 4, level 5, you know, where the human doesn't have to ever take control. And so why do we need this little technology? Because it's going to become obsolete super fast. I don't think it's that super fast. I think we still have a long way to go. And so if there is a way that we can maintain the consumer privacy and, you know, understand the implications of driver monitoring and become comfortable with it, can be a useful tool to ensure safety. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that if a vehicle is taking control of some of my driving tasks, that I know that it knows that I know that everybody is going to be okay. And I think that driver monitoring is an important piece of that. I still think so.
You're 110% right that driver monitoring is important. It's dangerous as we go into level 3 and we see the big debate around level 3, and you can make the argument. Alex Roy, who's at Argo now, makes the argument that it's not possible without driver monitoring. When we get to levels 4 and levels 5 of autonomy, What happens to driver monitoring? Does that eventually go away, or does that stay in there for in-cabin protection, or is it reused for something else?
I could see it staying, but again, with maybe a different use case. And so, but this also gets into the privacy debate again. But some could say that it might be usable for personalization, even authentication. Just a few years back, we weren't using our face to unlock our phones either. But here we are. We're doing that. We're trusting that. So there are possibilities, even with safety too. I could see where occupant detection, where people are sitting, how much they weigh, how tall they are, might help with some of the safety features that would pick up in the event of a crash. I think it could be helpful in that, if we could get over the privacy and security concerns. Yeah.
Privacy is going to be the key. And Tim Cook, whenever Project Titan becomes a reality, he's going to emphasize privacy. You're going to have other companies that are going to emphasize privacy, but you're going to have that on one spec. But then on the other hand, you're going to have all these individual companies work together and come together and say, this is how we're going to do it. And that's one of the really awesomely cool things that you're doing at the Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium. You have these incredible traditional automotive companies that are legacy companies that have been around forever doing really great things. So you have Silicon Valley and Detroit coming together. How do you manage that where it's like I don't know, you want to call it like a kumbaya moment. Everybody's like, you know what? Okay, we're going to do what's right. And we're going to do what's good.
If I told you it was easy, would you believe me? No,
possibly.
I think this is why I kind of, when I found this role, I thought, wow, this is my dream job, because I get to work with the Star Trek people. I get to work with, the OEMs who've had years and decades of safety experience. And so they both bring, and I say both, but really there's more than two. But, in our case, if you look at different sides, they all bring something to the table, and all of that needs to be considered. And what I love about the AVSC is that everybody who's a member agrees with that, that everybody brings something to the table, and that we listen, we debate, and we try to come to 100% consensus on what we're putting out there. And if we can't come to consensus, then we say, why is that? Why is it more difficult for this company versus this company? And it's awesome, because it gets the conversations going that maybe aren't being had anywhere else. I mean, where else do you have these different diverse types of companies hashing out the same topics at the same time? I think that's really one of the main strengths of the AVSC.
So for our listeners that might not be familiar with the SAE, ITC, and AVSC, could you please kindly share a high-level overview of that organization?
Sure. So AVSC is put on by SAE ITC,
which stands for Industry Technologies Consortia.
And ITC is an affiliate of SAE International, which is the group that most people are familiar with. SAE International puts out standards based on committees, groups of subject matter experts representing themselves and their own, expertise, and bringing those into consensus standards. Whereas ITC, we bring together groups of companies or, academia or, public, private organizations. In the case of AVSC, we're a group of companies, and each member company is representing their organization. And so that's the difference. And I think that is really powerful for a couple of reasons. Number one is that you're representing your company and not just your own, technical opinion. So you've got some debate that might be going on in your own organization that you have to bring and we can hash out together. But then the second thing that's really powerful is that we put out these best practices and our members agree to implement them. So, they can't just say we're going to do one thing and then, not do it. They actually are making the agreement formally that they're going to go forward with these best practices on their own. So that means you have 7 companies that are, all doing similar things, speaking the same language. And that's really powerful to then take into those standards committees and bring it forward, hopefully quicker.
One of the really cool best practices that the AVSC has released is the first responder interactions with fleet managed automated driving system dedicated vehicles. How did this best practice become a reality? Did you sit down with law enforcement and first responders to gather their real world feedback on how they currently operate with vehicles and bring it back to the consortium?
Yeah, this is a really good example of how we come together on these topics in the first place. This one started out based on a report by Crash Avoidance Metrics Partnership, or CAMP, and some research done by Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, or VTTI. They put out a report of common scenarios that a first responder, so not just law enforcement, but also first responders like an ambulance or fire truck or any sort of personnel that is first at a scene, what types of interactions are really important to them. And so we took that research that was done and we said, okay, we know that these things are really important to first responders. We want to make sure that first responders, just because there's this new type of vehicle out there, they can still do their job in keeping us safe, keeping the public safe. That's hard enough. And so instead of taking the approach where we say, okay, here's how our automated vehicles work, and here's what you need to know, first responders, we said, no, what do first responders need? And as developers and manufacturers, what are we going to do to make their jobs easier? And so we took the research that was done, and then we said, okay, how are we going to put these into practical, feasible recommendations for industry to implement? And went through the different types of interactions, different use cases, and what would be the next step as a design, as you're designing this technology, what should you take into account? And I think that's really important because if you don't factor those things in from the beginning, you'll struggle later on to try and squeeze them in. And the other part that we really like to highlight there is that there needs to be an interaction plan. So you, as your company, as you're putting these vehicles out either for test or full-scale deployment, you need to have an engagement with the first responder community. And this is happening today, in the states where there's testing on roads. Companies are getting together with their local first responder communities and providing this. But our thought was, well, if there's consistency in it and a common language, then it will help spread the word a lot easier and make it more comprehensive for the first responder community. You could also use these recommendations to start on a training program for first responders. So we see a lot of possibilities, maybe a gap that was there before that we're filling in. And that's a good example of what we're trying to do everywhere, looking for those gaps and trying to either fill them with some sort of solution or recommendation or start a conversation around it.
Are the interaction plans generally accepted by the local police, the sheriff, the highway patrol? Do these companies go out and say, hello, Mr. Sheriff, hello, Mrs. Sheriff, we're going to operate in your thing. Here's our interaction plan. My name is Mr. Grayson, and here's my cell phone numbers of our vehicles. Please call us. Does that go into the interaction plan?
That is a very simplified view of it, yes. But basically, that's what it is. I mean, there's local regulations for, maybe some steps that a manufacturer might have to take in order to get their vehicles allowed on the road legally. So maybe a Department of Transportation will have, their own rules, like here's what you need to provide me in order to get your vehicle on the road. And so they'll go through that. And one of the items in our best practice is actually to make sure that there's some way to contact the fleet operator. So yes, there has to be some sort of contact with the company.
And so you have this law enforcement individual cruising around in their car or on their motorbike, and for something happened and they have to engage with the autonomous vehicle. How will they end up engaging with it? Do they call Mr. Grayson at dispatch and say, hey, we got an issue? Or does the officer knock on the window and say, hello, Mr. Robot, open up, please? How does that work?
Well, hopefully there's an interaction plan and some training that has already happened. That's part of what we're trying to say. But let's use that example of securing a scene. If you're the law enforcement officer and you're about to approach a vehicle, you need to know whether it's okay to approach it, right? You want to make sure it doesn't drive away, it doesn't drive toward you. There's lots of factors. So you want a way to disable it. You might need to move it out of the roadway. You would need access to something that allows you to do that. So depending on the manufacturer, they might have different ways to solve that issue. It might be calling the fleet operator and saying, hey, you need to take remote action and move your vehicle off the road, or there might be a feature within the vehicle that just, allows the law enforcement individual to control it in some way. So we're not, in our best practices, we're not taking the approach where we say it has to be done exactly like this. We're saying you need to have the capability for someone in law enforcement or in first responder capability to disable a vehicle. You need to make sure that they can approach it safely. You should make sure that there's a way to determine the presence of passengers. Are there passengers in the vehicle? Is it empty? There has to be a way to show that. How you do that as a manufacturer is up to you, but these are the key aspects that you should consider.
And that's all in the interaction plan that's on file with the law enforcement or first responders in that community where the vehicles are operating?
Yep, that's the idea.
It's fascinating because you're doing really good by the community, but you're also building trust. You're saying, hello, Mr. or Mrs. Law Enforcement, we're a trustworthy partner. This is how it works. So I got to give you a lot of credit there because it's something that's really smart. I'm really good friends with the founding team at Zoox. I know that was one of their, Mark Roskai's and Burke Kaufman's priorities from day one was to put that out there with the interaction plan because Mark's father was a law enforcement official. So to him, it was deeply personal. That was one of the first things that they did. And it's really great to see in the consortium and companies outside the consortium all doing really good. And recently the AVSC has released a best practice for metrics and methods for assessing safety performance of automated driving systems. Could you talk about this as well, please?
Yes, I would love to. So this is a big one for us. And this is our most recent publication. It's available on our website. We want you all to go download it and read it. But this was, one of the reasons that ABSC was formed in the first place was to, how do we ensure that these vehicles are safe to go on public roads, right? And we know that this is a really complex topic, that it's not something that's easily solved. And so, over the course of, the last year or so, we've been talking through these things. And also, I'm sure you're aware, there are a lot of discussions going on in many different disparate organizations, lots of research, there's standards making in progress, there's tons going on with this. And so, one of the things that we pointed out, again, looking for gaps is, are we speaking the same language? I think that if we're not talking in a common language, then we're going to really struggle to communicate with each other and understand each other. And this is just talking about the technical community, right? We'll get into the public in a minute, but basically, how do we talk about these things? Where do we begin? And so the way that this best practice is laid out is that we're saying we have identified a foundational set of metrics that we want everyone to start with, and we as member companies are going to start with these. They may seem pretty obvious, but it's funny to think that, one person or one company is calling it one way and another company is calling, the same thing something different. And so just by commonizing the terminology, we're making a step forward. The other thing that this does is it enables consistency of safety performance assessment for, and again, our consortium is talking strictly about level 4 and level 5. These are the ones that don't need drivers, and in some cases may not have a steering wheel or brakes or anything. And so, we're not talking about the level 3 technology that might be out there today. So, but one of the things that we want to make sure of is that there's a way to tie in existing data that may even be able to be compared with human driver statistics today. So some things like crash frequency, crash severity, citations, or citable situations. And so we want to make sure that we're not waiting for those things to happen. There has to be some sort of predictive element too. And so in our best practice, we talk about, here are the outcomes that can be correlated to this existing data. but here are some predictive indicators that we think are the most important that you should look at first. And oh, by the way, these aren't going to work on their own. We don't want you to take our document and say, this is it, this is all you have to do. We're basically saying, no, this is the starting point, and it is expected and assumed that you're going to take these and build upon them with your own, flavor of metrics, however you want to do it. But if you're doing these things and we can all talk to each other about these same things, then we've made a step in the right direction.
What is the website that listeners can go to read about this that you mentioned?
The website is absc.sae-itc.org. It's a tough one. Or you could just do a search for ABSC.
It's a good one. So I got to ask you, so a company implements an AVSC best practice. How is trust developed with the public? Is there a good housekeeping seal of approval inside of a mobility app? Like, how is that saying, hey, we're a company that's doing good, we're not cutting corners, we're putting safety first? How does that communicate to the public in a way that they can understand in a non-technical jargon?
So that is the challenge. I think that, I mentioned earlier that getting engineers or technical-minded folks speaking the same language is the first step. I think that, we can't wait to start talking to the public until we have all this stuff figured out. So we have to do it in parallel. But I do think that, I wish that there was an app for that. I wish there was a way that, we could just say, yep, this is good, but that's not how it works. So in my career, and being in a technical field my whole career, you always go to the family parties where they ask, oh, well, how's work? What are you working on these days? And that was always my challenge, to try and take what I'm doing and translate it into something my grandmother would understand. And, I think that that's a really important skill. And so one of the things that we're doing with AVSC is, as we're writing these documents, we want them to speak to all audiences at the same time. And we want to make sure that it's written in a way that, maybe not my grandmother, but, someone who's not an engineer could pick up the paper and be like, oh, this is cool. The companies that are in the AVSC are really keeping safety at the forefront of what they're doing. It's really interesting that they're doing these things. That's about all we're going to get at this point. But then the second thing that we can do is, things like we're doing today with this podcast, or, speaking at panels, talking to public agencies, just getting the word out there that, there is collaboration happening, and it's for the purpose of, setting the foundation and creating that common language and just getting everybody talking about it. Because if we don't understand how these vehicles were put together, at least at a very rudimentary level, we won't want to put our kids in them. I think that we have to think as human beings too about, are we going to trust our lives with these things? And if so, what do we need to know? And so every time we're talking as a group and we're doing these outreach things, I try to think of it that way. Like, what would my aunt or uncle or mom or dad, want to know before they feel like they can get into an automated vehicle?
What you just described I think was one of the best things that ever happened in terms of public adoption, was when SAE hosted demo days, and we went around the country. We put individuals in the vehicles, children in the vehicles. There was this meaningful impact, and we had individuals that went in there and they were terrified, and they came out and said, I'm extremely bored. This was great. This was boring. Mm-hmm. And we're like, okay, goal achieved. But we eliminated that myth by putting them in the vehicles, allowing them to meet the engineers, experience technology. And that's what has to happen. You can't put them down and say, biddy boppity boop, here we are. You have to build public trust. And as we look to build public trust, and you look to implement, continue the best practices, what is the future of the AVSC?
I think that the AVSC will evolve as needed. So the industry is moving very fast. Some may even claim today that it's already here, which I strongly disagree with. There's still a lot of work to do. But I think that when we describe AVSC and the topics that we tackle, we will show on a slide usually a puzzle piece, or a puzzle that's unfinished, and there's pieces going here and there and wherever. we'll continue to try to find where those missing pieces are and then try to fill that gap. And so wherever that takes us, that's where we need to go. And I think that the other key thing is that we need to continue to learn from other industries. So there are other industries that have had automated vehicles already of some way, shape, or form. What can we learn? What can we learn from what's already been done? How can we partner that with what we already know about building safe vehicles today? And that's where those decades of experience come in. So all of this bringing together and having that community that trusts each other, that knows that they can speak openly on a topic and representing their company, I think is just fantastic. It's magical. I love it.
And that's why you're in this incredible position, because you had this incredible imagination as a child, because then you have the curiosity and going back to Star Trek, what can we build? So you're always trying to put those pieces of the puzzle together. So you're the absolute right person to do this, frankly, the perfect person to do. So I can't wait to see what the next puzzle piece is. And Amy, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
I think the first thing is that companies developing this technology are first and foremost thinking about your safety. This is not, like any other consumer device where if it locks up or you get the blue screen of death, it's just annoying. We're talking about people's lives. And I want the public to know that that is paramount. Like, that is the priority. And in fact, the goal, I didn't even realize this until I got really into these discussions and this community, that the real goal is making driving safer. So instead of looking at it like, oh, I'm going to get into an automated vehicle and my risk has just gone up, think of it as your risk is going down because you're taking out human error. Now, again, there's a long way to go, but I think that's the ultimate goal for all of us. And so we'll see less crashes, we'll have less fatalities, we'll be safer.
Yeah, and as we heard, safety is paramount for this technology, and this technology will improve safety. Today is tomorrow, tomorrow is today. Always be curious, always be learning. And Amy, thank you so much for coming on the SAE podcast today.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.